There we go.
Greetings, everyone, to the first episode of the Algorithms of Empire podcast. This is a podcast that is co-hosted by the University of Toronto's Center for Ethics, the Algorithmic Bias Project, and the Clay-Gilmore Institute for Philosophy, Technology, and Counterinsurgency. AI is a big topic today, and it's often marketed as a utopian type of ideal and a promise of singularity, efficiency, and more precision. But its foundations actually lie in war making, surveillance, different types of control methods. And in this podcast, we want to explore how the military origins of AI and the military evolutions of AI bleed into civilian life, from drone warfare and predictive policing to hiring algorithms and consumer data markets. This interest has led us to our first guest, a brilliant researcher named Dr. Sarah Shoker. We want to invite her today to discuss her book, Military Age Males and Counterinsurgency and Drone Warfare. So me and my co-host Rakeem welcome you, Dr. Shoker.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Yeah. And
Mhm.
so I'll kick it off with our first question. Our first question really was focused on how the label of the military age male shaped the treatment and public perception of boys like Omar Kadir, and what did that dynamic reveal about how age, race, and threat perception interacted in post 9/11 counterinsurgencies?
Yeah, so for some context setting, for those who don't know, Omar was a Canadian citizen, or is a Canadian citizen, and he was accused at the age of 15 of killing a US soldier, Christopher Spear, in a firefight with the Taliban. And in that firefight, Omar Khadr was also seriously injured. He was initially held at Bagram, and then he was later transferred to Guantanamo Bay, where he was classified as an unlawful enemy combatant. He was detained with adults, and he was also repeatedly interrogated. He was not the only child at Guantanamo. But the Pentagon did release its three youngest prisoners. So they were aged 13 to 15 years old, and they released them to UNICEF in Afghanistan. But it refused to release minors aged 16 or older. And of course, Omar Khadr was aging while he was in detention. I should also note that the Canadian government, the Harper government, was not keen to take him back, even under pressure from the Obama administration when the Obama administration inherited Guantanamo. So Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, when asked why the United States was detaining children, repeatedly stated that these detainees are not children. And as time went on, Omar Khadr was probably the most famous or infamous child soldier or minor held at Guantanamo. And he's also the first minor prosecuted for war crimes in US history.
Wow.
Um, yeah. Um, so this detention took place under the Bush administration, and they argued that their treatment of Omar Khadr was completely lawful under the Geneva Conventions. And the argument that they made basically was that the Taliban had not effectively distinguished themselves from the civilian population of Afghanistan, thereby violating the convention's prescription that military members should be uniformed or wear distinctive signs. That is a requirement under international law. Um, so there wasn't really a disavowal of international law under the Bush administration per se. Rather, the law was reinterpreted to serve policy purpose. And this is also how you got the now infamous torture memos under the Bush administration, which argued that so-called enhanced interrogation techniques may be legally permissible. Um, as for the construction of childhood, basically what you saw were repeated attempts by policymakers to assure the general public that these were not vulnerable child soldiers who could, in another political climate perhaps, may have been construed as in need of rehabilitation. So they were instead framed as hardened killers who were not like good American children. So as opposed to children in the global north, child detainees and even just regular children who merely exist in conflict zones became ascribed with this type of political agency that did not really exist for Western children. And some of the rhetoric at this time was actually quite astonishing. So, for instance, David Kilcullen, who's a famous Australian counterinsurgent who worked with the Americans, advised soldiers, and I'm actually going to quote here, to keep children at arm's length because children are sharp-eyed, lacking empathy, and willing to commit atrocities their elders would shrink from. And Kilcullen writes that although soldiers may be homesick and missing their own children, they cannot treat children in insurgencies in the same way that children back home are treated. And I think while we can look at these types of statements and say now this is just empirically incorrect, I think it's also important to remember that this type of advice was meant to create a type of hypervigilance for American soldiers and counterinsurgents that likely amplified existing historical biases and could have actually created prejudicial outcomes in the way that they targeted and identified civilians from combatants.
Wow. Well, I didn't know he was the first child to be prosecuted in U.S. history. That's fascinating.
Yeah, for war crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Also, given that military-aged male is not a legal category under international humanitarian law, but rather a construct shaped by U.S. policy, are there other nations in the global north that use a similar distinction in their military or security practices? And what does that suggest about how threat is defined in the global north?
Yeah, Canada and the UK have fighting age male. And recently there have been politicians and media in both the US and the UK that have referred to immigrants and asylum seekers as military age males or males of fighting age. Nigel Farage has used the term males of fighting age to refer to migrants entering Britain. I think this is a pretty transparent strategy to anyone, and it's meant to shape your perception of who is risky and who is vulnerable. It's a term that transforms a young man into a risky subject, and it evokes fears of invasion by tying young men to mobilized violence. And the reason it sounds like common sense is because of a historical connection between men and the draft and the fact that men tend to be the majority in fighting forces around the world, often because they were or are forced to. And it uses that connection to deceptively suggest that there is an immutable reality that will always connect men to military violence. It's leading language, and the US eventually conceded that point. So, for example, the Army Center for Lessons Learned released a report on civilian casualty prevention in Afghanistan that calls out the problem with the term military age male as biasing soldiers away from taking due care with applying force. And if you track the usage, you know also that the term is used against racialized foreign men. It is not a term that politicians use to describe domestic audiences, or in the case of right-wing populism, the term isn't used to describe men who are perceived to be legitimate members of the political community. But I think it's critical to note that this term has effectively left the military domain or the domain of international armed conflict and has entered into domestic politics through the politics of migration. And so instead of so-called forever wars abroad, certain political figures have created a narrative where it's, for instance, the UK that is now the conflict zone. And that narrative tends to be predictive of the type of policy that politicians will advocate for to treat, in this case, migrants. So more concerningly, and as the audience is likely aware, there's been a significant uptake of think pieces warning about the end of the liberal international order. And if you want to think about the stakes as it applies to understanding who is a civilian, who is a combatant, can we call combatants military age males, and how are these distinctions actually blurred? Well, the international order and the application of international humanitarian law really relies on the correct ability to be able to discriminate between civilians and combatants. If you can't do that, you have absolute war. And so those are the stakes. And that's why actually I ended up spending 4 to 5 years studying the term military age male, which might appear as overkill to some audiences, but it makes a lot more sense when you recognize that the principle of distinction has actually been really critical to reducing the harm caused in international conflict.
Indeed, I think that was one of the eye-opening things about reading the book is that it is not international law, it's U.S. policy, and that was very eye-opening because and also you kind of mentioned one thing I've kind of noticed is how the term and or idea and concept is even being used in certain pop culture instances, where I saw Bill Maher recently in one of his interviews kind of mention this idea of military age male and migrants and who should be allowed to come.
Yeah, there was a similar conversation in Canada with as it relates to the refugee crisis from the Syrian civil war and the deprioritization of young men, young Syrian men who were single, because they were viewed as a potential risk factor. And the way the media narrative constructed those young men seeking asylum really framed them as a potential threat or a potential threat that was waiting to explode. So the Trudeau government at the time, I think, reached this compromise position where they deprioritized those young men from, I guess, the asylum queue, or and yeah, I mean, it's not surprising to me that these instances continue to exist to this day. It's a long-standing historical trope.
Mhm.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about some of these tropes and the way that these counterinsurgencies are shaped, and the public opinion around them are shaped. So in your book, you talk about two different administrations. You talk about the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And I was wondering about the Obama administration in particular. How did his administration's practice of excluding military age males from the official civilian casualty count, how did that shape perceptions of civilian harm in U.S. military operations?
Yeah, so for the audience, again, to context set a little bit, in 2012, the New York Times released an investigative piece showing that military-aged males, so men around 15, the age of 15 to 60, though in practice, often younger, were excluded from the collateral damage count from drone strikes. So the first thing that did basically was allow for a drastically lower collateral damage count that was then reported to the media. And at the very least, the United States does not want to appear at all as though its drone or counterinsurgency programs impact civilian life. So if you recall, the CIA argued that no civilians died from drone strikes in 2011. And then in 2012, the U.S. government officials stated that civilian deaths that resulted from drone strikes were in the single digits. This was not really believed by anyone. So in 2016, after intense legal pressure from advocacy groups like the ACLU, the U.S. finally admitted that between 64 and 116 civilian deaths from 2009 to 2015 happened in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya. So these are countries that are framed as outside areas of active hostilities, which is also, that term is also a policy creation that comes out of the Obama era. But, again, according to all independent sources, this is still a drastic undercounting of civilian death. And the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, for instance, which was extremely active during this same period in tallying civilian death, estimates that the death count was 6 times higher than the U.S. claims. But interestingly, if you look at the total number of deaths calculated by the Bureau and compare them to what the U.S. government stated, that total tally of both civilian and combatant death was the same. And so what that means numerically is that the military-aged male term functioned as this little definitional difference that translated to a big difference in the numbers when calculating the collateral damage count and the toll.
Wow. I think
Wow, that's amazing. Like they reported none, like
that
no civilian death. I mean, that was amazing. Whoa.
Well, out of that same period, this joke, I think it was a policymaker speaking anonymously. They stated that the CIA, I'm paraphrasing very roughly here, but that the CIA can see three guys doing jumping jacks in Pakistan and they'll assume that they're combatants. So I think that, you know, publicly this was not a well accepted narrative. And I think, again, due credit to a number of those advocacy organizations that really pushed for a more accurate accounting, even if still an undercounting.
I think that's the perfect segue to the next question, because in your book you also note that drone strikes may kill fewer people than conventional airstrikes, but the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths is not necessarily proportional. How does this challenge the common narrative that drones are inherently more precise or humane in counterinsurgency warfare? And I think because people may not understand that that's how drone warfare is marketed to the public, as a more precise, more clean way of doing war.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And there is also a long history of so-called, smart bombs, precision technologies as being framed as the solution to the problem of civilian protection. That being said, I do think we need to be wary of any narrative that positions a technology as possessing an inherent ability to discriminate between civilians and combatants. And drones and today AI can elicit a type of tech fetishization where they are presented as the solution to what is often a bureaucratic and policy problem, or a policy or a problem of training and doctrine. So that technology, a technology that inevitably leads to better discrimination between civilians and combatants. That technology does not currently exist. And in fact, the very reason policymakers currently talk about human in the loop or appropriate human judgment as it relates to AI today, or AI being used in conflict zones today, is because the international community, with some caveats, largely agrees that human beings need to be the ones who administer life or death decisions, and it's a human that needs to be accountable. That ability to apply proportionality, discrimination, ensuring that military action meets the standards of necessity and precaution as identified under international law. There was no and is no technology that is applying those standards today. Those are tasks left to soldiers and military lawyers.
Hmm.
Now, you can be selective with the weapon you choose to ensure that you're not causing undue harm, and you may in fact be required under international law to be selective with with the weapon that you choose. But the narrative frequently overemphasizes technology and hypes the technology's capability, often at the expense of forgetting the role of training troops and policy that allows for, more expansive or restrictive collateral damage. The rules of engagement can be significantly tightened to ensure that you are prioritizing civilian protection.
Hmm.
And there are times when the rules of engagement have also been loosened so that you do not need to prioritize civilian protection to that same extent. And yet the same technologies can still exist in both scenarios. And that tells me, and that should tell any researcher, that technology is not here to necessarily save us. This is an ideological problem. It's a problem of training. It's a problem of bureaucracy. It's a policy problem.
One thing that I appreciate that you mentioned in your book, we don't have to go get too deep into it, but it relates to this about the ghost work that goes into,
Mm.
how these autonomous weapons work. And I think that's also something that I didn't think about until I read this book.
Yeah, I mean, there's been an excellent, there's been a lot of excellent research done on the role of invisible labor in programming AI systems. And ghost work is not my term, but the term of researchers that come out of science and technology studies that really try to illustrate that the values that these technologies enable are often the result of annotators, data labelers, and they're often not paid very well. They're distributed across the globe. And we often like to think about AI technologies as being autonomous, but really they still very much rely on human input, and they are just as embodied as remotely piloted drones or aircraft, I would argue.
No, I like that follow up because it really, that ghost work, the idea of ghost work, it really recenters the human in this like broader discussion about potentially autonomous AI and agents. And I think the next question is related to that. But just for context as well for the audience, I think a lot of people might think of warfare as something that's strictly kinetic, that's between two fighting forces. But counterinsurgency actually historically involves learning a lot about the culture of the target population and centering those human relationships to better, penetrate and manipulate them. And so in the US post 9/11 context, we've seen programs like the Human Terrain System use anthropological and cultural knowledge to assist in their military operations. And I wanted to know more about that and why did they face such strong pushback from the American Anthropological Association and other ethicists?
Right. So you're completely right, that counterinsurgency has not, the so-called strategy of winning hearts and minds has often emphasized non-kinetic action. Um, and it's the application of so-called population-centric warfare, where where the local population is essentially co-opted into the war effort. So the Human Terrain System was a program from the United States Army Training and Doctrine and Command, so TRADOC, that embedded social scientists, not all anthropologists, but they were civilian social scientists with military personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the goal of providing cultural knowledge about local populations, the so-called human terrain, to military personnel and commanders. And an article in Foreign Affairs actually described the human terrain system as embedding academics in foxholes. And it is also routinely cited as the largest US government investment in a single social science project in US history. And it cost about $750 million from 2007 and 2014. That is not in today's dollars. I have not factored in inflation. And as for, why the American Anthropological Association came out against, I guess, anthropologists in particular joining the program, the simplest answer is that they released a statement back in 2007 saying that involvement violated the AAA's code of ethics for a few reasons, especially as it relates to their do no harm principle. So I mean, I can get a little bit deeper into this, but and I think that the list of ethical concerns stated by the AAA actually resonates across academic disciplines, especially for those who do field work. But they do boil down to doing no harm to the people and communities that you study. So if you're a social scientist who works with human subjects, you know that you have a requirement to disclose who you are and what you're doing. And the AAA thought that anthropologists would be placed in situations where they would not be able to distinguish between themselves and military personnel. They also argued that anthropologists might have responsibilities to their US military units, and that could potentially conflict with their obligations to the persons or communities that they were studying. And then on top of that, anthropologists and any social scientist working with human subjects is expected to get informed consent from human participants. And in a setting of armed conflict, attaining informed consent without the threat of coercion looming overhead, the AAA thought that process would be significantly compromised, if not outright eliminated. And then, of course, there's the actual physical risk to the academics themselves. They are civilians, and I believe 4 academics were actually killed during the time that the HTS was put into place. So I do think that the AAA raises some really interesting ethical questions, and among them, can you do professional anthropology if it's in the service of a military strategy? And perhaps at a broader level, the AAA's criticism of HTS as violating an anthropologist's professional code of conduct, I think is also itself an attempt at a professionalization of anthropology, really putting a stake in the ground as to what type of conduct turns someone into a professional anthropologist in the United States. Now, outside of the association, I think it is interesting to note that the human terrain system today was largely seen as not living up to its expectations, including by security practitioners and policymakers within DoD. And there are a number of retrospectives online that people can dig into if they're interested in learning more. That foreign affairs piece that I cited earlier is called Academics in Foxholes, and it's actually a really great place to start.
No, that's fascinating. I didn't know about that piece. Yeah, I don't see a way you could do that uh, without, having an allegiance to the military and military objectives. I mean, academics in foxholes.
Mm, right.
It's pretty
Yeah.
plain, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the anthropologists who were there and spoke favorably of their experience, what really comes out from those conversations is they really were, they were adopting a harm mitigation or harm reduction strategy, whereas the AAA was adopting a do no harm strategy.
Mm.
And so we see where those two ethical principles end up butting heads. Um, I don't pretend to have the solution or the way to reconcile both of those principles, but I think they raise some really interesting and fascinating questions.
Absolutely. One thing that I wanted to ask was, how did the military age male construct facilitate the use of mass surveillance, high-tech targeting, and gendered population control measures in post 9/11 era U.S. coin?
Yeah, so Miron Hoythink has this great piece in a recent issue of Minds and Machines, where they track the use of the term living laboratories to describe conflict zones as sites where you deploy new technologies, new experimental technologies to study their effects, ostensibly for a future state-to-state conflict involving the United States and China, or so one such narrative goes. In the contemporary climate, it's not unusual to hear this language ascribed to Ukraine and Gaza.
Mm.
But that so-called experimental period also existed in Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan. Counterinsurgency and also the acceleration of drone warfare is taking place at the same time. New algorithmic technologies and data collection technologies are being deployed in armed conflict. So, and just to give you a few examples, as of 2012, or sorry, as of 2012, the U.S. Army, for example, had managed to collect biometric data on over 800,000 Afghans. And
Wow.
we know this because both The Economist and The Guardian reported on it. So in areas of high violence, all so-called fighting age males, which was the term used by The Economist, were subjected to iris and fingerprint scans, which then would give the US soldiers a quantified assessment of the person's risk profile. And this means that sometimes patrols would call all men from a village out of their homes, line them up by a mosque to be logged. And other times buses would be stopped arbitrarily and then all the men would be taken off and scanned. As another example, there is this fantastic investigative piece by Sharon Weinberger in Foreign Policy that she wrote around 2017, and it documented DARPA's Nexus 7 program. And that essentially crowdsourced data from Afghan civilians for the purpose of intelligence collection.
Mm.
So Afghan civilians, usually they were employees in the development sector, were given GPS-enabled phones, and they were instructed to mark the location of buildings and streets. And they were not told what this was, what the purpose of this program was for. They weren't told that it was associated with DARPA, and then DARPA itself also never publicly announced the program. So Nexus 7, the Nexus 7 program, its ultimate goal was to gain a clearer understanding about the social fabric in Afghanistan by turning Afghan civilians into data intelligence feeds, and that would provide, near real-time access of intelligence to U.S. and coalition forces. And then finally, I think I'll end off with this example. This is also the same time period where the CIA is collecting metadata to create predictive algorithms about who it is that they should target. And one program, which the CIA called, and I'm not joking, they called it Skynet. Don't know why.
Right.
Used a random forest algorithm, which is just a basic algorithm that any data scientist would be familiar with. And they collected 80 different attributes to assign a weight on the likelihood that the man or boy in question was an insurgent. So in 2016, and the reason I know and we know about this is that in 2016 is that Ars Technica reported that Skynet deemed Ahmed Zaidan, who was Al Jazeera's bureau chief in Islamabad, they deemed him a member of Al-Qaeda. So not only was Zaidan classified as an insurgent, but Skynet selected him as the individual with the highest score,
Wow.
meaning that he was the individual most likely to be an insurgent out of all those who traveled between Peshawar and Lahore. So this is actually a really, I think, instructive case example of why algorithmic prediction can go wrong. So Zaidan's a journalist, right? So that means that he interviews insurgents, especially if he's located in Pakistan, and he travels frequently due to his job as a journalist. But his occupation meant that he displayed similar mobility patterns to the insurgents that he interviewed. And this is an issue that, this problem is an issue that persists with today's algorithmic systems. We make this really big assumption that combatant and civilian behavior is going to be distinct enough and that an algorithmic system will be able to pick up on this distinction. But again, that's a really big assumption. And examples like Skynet reveal what happens when you take that assumption as a given.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just the idea of how a lot of journalists were being mistaken for insurgents. But you mentioned one thing about the Nexus. Was it Nexus 7? Is that what it?
Yeah.
So what would happen if they refused and said, "Hey, that would bring suspicion on them," correct?
I am only going by what Sharon Weinberger was able to report in foreign
Okay.
policy.
Hmm.
I am not sure what refusal would have done. I believe there were hundreds of participants in the program. I say that because, at one point in the article, Weinberger mentions that there are hundreds of intelligence data feeds, but I
Hmm.
don't specifically have the number of people who were enrolled in that program. They did try to create an incentive for participation, where
Hmm.
basically, if you participated, you got to keep your phone.
Right.
So I don't know, based on that incentive structure, I would be cautious to assume that they were coerced into that program. It sounds like they were trying to entice and recruit instead.
Right.
But I could be wrong. I can't say for sure one way or another.
Yeah, that Nexus 7 program was under tight wraps. So, I mean, it's not really been much reported about it some time now. Um, yeah.
Yeah, DARPA too. I mean, it is a research organization, and they hadn't been in the field since Vietnam. So going back into Afghanistan with this project was the first time in several decades where they were essentially deploying experimental technologies using local populations. So I'm not surprised that there
Yeah.
wasn't much written about it, but for those who are interested, that foreign policy piece is truly excellent.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think in many ways, when you're talking about the use of all of this new type of algorithmic and predictive technologies in your book, you also talk about drones being really a logical consequence of the practice of counterinsurgency in this modern period, being that asymmetric or non-state actors usually don't have air forces. And so that leaves insurgents with less infrastructure open to be targeted by these kind of low cost and different types of weapons platforms. But
Mhm.
given what you were just saying about this this type of historical sequence where you have the post 9/11 wars and you have all these new AI and predictive technologies. I mean, would you say that AI enabled weapons like these drones we've been discussing or other mass surveillance tools like Nexus 7, are these also logical extensions of counterinsurgency and how it's practiced in the US?
Yeah. So I struggle with this question a little bit. I, I I do think that because AI in armed conflict remains novel, according to some definitions of AI, and the definition, what AI is seems to, does change by the decade and sometimes by
Right.
the year.
Yeah.
But let's assume, let's leave that aside for now. I think AI, as we understand it today, remains pretty novel in armed conflict. And because the United States is not involved in near pure armed conflict. The use of AI today is we've seen in Ukraine, and especially we've seen it with the IDF's use of lavender to identify targets in Gaza. Um, I think that it is clear to me that AI has first appeared in armed conflict in countries that international relations scholars call the periphery.
Mm.
So these conflicts are asymmetrical. They are, typically against, it's typically a well-resourced dominant power against a smaller country like, Russia against Ukraine, or, a non-state actor like Israel against Hamas. And I don't see that trend disappearing, especially if the goal is to treat armed conflict in the periphery as a living laboratory where these tools can be deployed rapidly and outside the typical timelines that are required for US procurement. So I think that trend is going to persist. However, I think I would caution against thinking of AI as exclusively a tool for counterinsurgents, who are well resourced and who come from the global north. In the same way that I would caution thinking about armed drones as exclusively a tool of the United States or coalition forces. So
Right.
democratic countries did make drone warfare popular, with that initial avalanche of investment. But we've also seen insurgents adapting consumer or commercial drones. Turkey, Iran, and China are all developers and exporters of drone technologies today. And in part, that's happened because it's cost efficient to
Mm.
manufacture drones, and there are low barriers of entry into that market. And similarly, with AI and AI decision support systems or autonomous weapon systems, it's, I think, important not to make the mistake of assuming that that one country is going to have a monopoly on that technology, or
Right.
in or indeed to think that because a regime self-identifies as liberal democratic, that the procurement of AI technology is necessarily going to result in the correct application of international humanitarian law, which I mentioned earlier. And I really do think it's this last point that I want to emphasize. There is just no technology that currently exists that inevitably upholds international law, even though there is some, what I'll call hype that does claim that democratic values can be programmed into the back end of an AI system. What we see today and what we saw in the post 9/11 period is that there wasn't really a consensus on what it means to apply international law. And in fact, what values are in fact democratic.
No, I really like that answer. So yeah, so it's not that so there is this relationship historically where these things are like synchronic. They happen at the
Mm.
same time. But that's not a relationship of necessity, right? So you will see like a asymmetric or unconventional actor like a Ukraine be able to seize this technology, maybe even better than a state actor can. So it's not a necessary relationship between liberal democracies and the use and development of AI, but they kind of
Mhm.
happen together in our historical moment.
Definitely. And I mean, I think with AI, especially since it's a software system, a software-based system, um, software proliferates. It's very difficult to prevent the proliferation of software-based systems. Even, and we see that today with the United States' export controls on chips and also semiconductor manufacturing materials. One of the reasons why they focus on hardware rather than software is because I think there's now this historical acknowledgement, in part because there was an attempt to create an export control regime on cyber-based tools that recognizes you can only really control the flow of hard goods, and software itself is just very susceptible to proliferation. It's also low cost. Where you have software engineers and easy to access hardware, you have the ability for probably non-state actors and low resource states to take advantage of those technologies.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Dr. Shoker.
Of course.
You muted, Rakeem.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. No, I was just going to say it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on. We definitely appreciate your book and your scholarship. And before we go, like, what inspired you to write this book and dedicate so much time in researching it? Because it's obviously a very well researched and well written book.
Well, thank you so much for your kind
Mhm.
words. Um, it's funny. I think sometimes because you're right, I did dedicate a significant amount of time, about 4 to 5 years. It was initially based on my PhD dissertation, and then I reworked it into a book format. Um, and I think on the outside, sometimes research can very much look like insanity. Uh, um, but yeah, I'll more seriously, I'll say there are two reasons or two main reasons. One is out of what Cynthia Enloe, a researcher and academic whom I admire very much, talks about. She calls this a feminist curiosity. I read, and I'm very much indebted to the journalists at the New York Times who unearthed unearthed the fact that military-age males were not counted were not included in the collateral damage count under the Obama administration's drone strikes. But I was somewhat surprised that what was essentially a passing phrase or paragraph did not receive more scholarly or media scrutiny. And because I had been taken by Cynthia Enloe's research, I actually paused when I heard the term military age male, and I thought, that is an extremely bizarre term.
Right.
It should not be taken for granted that this is common sense, that it makes sense to include young men and boys in the collateral damage count. And I'm going to follow this term. And in this case, it led me to the Obama era. It led me to the Bush administration and all the way back to Vietnam. I'm going to follow this term and see where it leads me. And it actually showed a type of logic that persisted throughout history and that managed to, in my view, threaten a number of liberal values, or so-called, or what we claim to be liberal values as it relates to who is and isn't a legitimate target. And
Mm.
that leads me to my second point. The ability to apply discrimination, in this case, I use the term discrimination as something that is normatively valuable. So the ability to tell the difference between a combatant and a civilian is what prevents us from absolute war. The international legal order, it is far from perfect, wholly insufficient, but it comes out of the ashes of the Second World War, where the international community made commitments, sometimes against their own national interests, and said never again. And the way to limit that whole scale absolute destruction is by saying civilians deserve legally certain protections. And a combatant is someone who willingly engages in armed conflict. It is not based on your gender, your age, your sexuality, your religion, whatever. It is not based on your identity. It is about what you choose to do in a situation of armed conflict. The term military age male, I think, can actually subvert that commitment.
Mm.
And I think right now we live in actually a very precarious time for international law. And we need to do all that we can to ensure that the application of international humanitarian law, or as they say in the United States, the laws of armed conflict, are upheld in the strongest manner possible. So that's why I ended up spending an obscene amount of time, I think, on researching one term.
Well, we are appreciative for that research, most definitely.
Oh, well, you are very welcome, and I am so glad that it was that you found it to be useful.
All right. That concludes the first episode of the Algorithms of Empire podcast. Until next time.